Yesterday, my brother-in-law, who is married to my sister, asked my wife to meet him for lunch. He said there was something important he needed to talk about. When my wife told me about the invitation, she seemed puzzled but not overly concerned. "Do you think it's about my sister?" she asked, furrowing her brow. "Maybe they're having problems, and he wants a woman's perspective." The situation struck me as odd since my brother-in-law had never reached out to my wife like this before. However, he often texted her and other family members about routine matters, so I didn't dwell on it. We're a close-knit family, and supporting each other isn't unusual. "Go find out," I said, shrugging off the unease. The next morning, as she got ready for work, my wife mentioned the lunch again. "I'm still not sure what this is about," she said, worry creeping into her voice. I reassured her, "It's probably nothing serious. Just listen to what he has to say, and we'll figure it out together." The cafe was bustling with the usual lunchtime crowd, which put my wife at ease. She arrived early and found a table by the window. He showed up a few minutes later, looking visibly nervous. They exchanged pleasantries and chatted about mundane topics, but as soon as their food arrived, he dove into the real reason he had asked to meet her. He started by complimenting her, calling her beautiful. At first, my wife thought he was just being polite. But he didn't stop there. His voice trembling slightly, he confessed, "I've loved you since the moment I first laid eyes on you. You're the light of my life. If you were mine, I'd treat you like a queen and give you everything you deserve." Stunned, my wife stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. He poured his heart out, claiming he had admired her from afar for years. He insisted they were meant to be together. My wife tried to interrupt, telling him he was making a huge mistake, but he spoke over her as if rehearsing a script he had memorized. To us, my brother-in-law had always been the fun uncle and a trusted member of our family. He frequently texted and called my wife, but it was always about ordinary family matters, nothing that had raised any red flags. His behavior had never seemed inappropriate. So to hear my wife recount this was like a gut punch. My wife couldn't bear to hear another word. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, and walked out. Shaking, she called me and recounted everything. While she was on the phone, texts from him started flooding in: apologies, excuses, and pleas for forgiveness. He claimed it was just infatuation and begged her not to tell my sister. When my wife came home early to talk to me, her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. I told her to answer one of his calls and put it on speaker. I wanted to hear him for myself. He was crying, begging her not to tell my sister, claiming he had misread signals and thought she felt the same way. Apparently, during a family gathering last weekend, he had interpreted my wife's playful banter as flirting. "I thought there was a connection," he said. He then swore on his kids' lives that he had never cheated on my sister before, insisting it was only her. I had heard enough. I told him we wouldn't act immediately but would call him the next day. After I hung up, I turned to my wife. She suggested we go to my sister's house and tell her everything right away. But the thought of destroying my sister's family made me sick. I couldn't bear to think about what this would do to my nieces. I knew telling my sister was the right thing to do. Still, I couldn't shake the fear that my family would blame my wife, even though she had done nothing wrong. This could destroy the close bond we've shared as a family, and I wasn't sure if we'd ever recover. Later that night, I got a call from my sister. Her voice was shaking as she said, "I need to tell you something." My heart sank as she explained that her husband had come to her in tears, claiming that my wife had tried to initiate an affair with him. He twisted the truth to make my wife the instigator, attempting to shift all the blame onto her. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told her the truth and assured her I would come over immediately to discuss everything face to face. Before leaving, I called my parents to explain the situation. They were shocked but agreed to head to my sister's house to watch the kids while we handled this. I also called my younger brother to stay with my kids during the chaos. My wife was already gathering her things, her face pale and determined. This was about to get much worse before it got better. My wife dreaded the confrontation, but we both knew it was necessary. The drive to my sister's house felt agonizingly long, though it wasn't far. The silence in the car was heavy, both of us lost in our thoughts. When we arrived, the tension was palpable. My sister stood on the porch, her arms crossed, and her husband sat slumped on the steps, looking like a defeated man. His eyes were bloodshot, his posture resigned. He knew we had the texts and voicemails, irrefutable proof of his betrayal. As we walked up, the air felt thick with unspoken words. My wife handed my sister her phone silently, her face a mix of controlled anger and deep hurt. My sister took it, her hands steady but her eyes blazing with a mix of fury and heartbreak. She scrolled through the texts, her expression hardening with each one she read. Then, she played the voicemails, her face remaining impassive as she listened to his pitiful confessions and my wife's firm refusals. Before she could say anything, my brother-in-law broke down. This was a man who faced danger daily as a firefighter, who had always seemed steady and strong. But now, his sobs were raw and guttural, echoing off the quiet night. It was surreal to see someone so tough utterly broken by his own actions. My sister, always resilient, stood unmoving. Her silence cut deeper than any words could. When he finally quieted, his sobs turning to sniffles, she spoke, her voice cold and unwavering. "Pack a bag and go," she said. "I can't stand to look at you." He tried to plead, his voice cracking, but she silenced him with a sharp, "Stop it. There's nothing you can say to make this better." Then she turned to my wife, pulling her into a hug. It was a powerful moment of solidarity, a small comfort in the midst of this nightmare. My wife, who had been friends with my sister since college, was visibly relieved that their bond remained intact despite everything. This left me alone with my brother-in-law. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, but I had no sympathy left to give. "You need to leave," I said firmly. "This is your mess. You need to deal with the consequences." Defeated, he nodded and trudged inside to pack his things. Meanwhile, my sister stayed with my wife, their quiet conversation offering them both a measure of support. The rest of the night was a blur of hushed conversations and hasty planning. We all rallied around my sister, figuring out how to protect her kids from the fallout and help her take the next steps. At one point, my sister asked my wife, "Why would he think any of this could work? Did he really believe you felt the same way?" Her voice wavered, a mix of disbelief and despair. My wife, now crying, handed her phone back to my sister. Together, they painstakingly combed through every text message between them over the past 2 years. They searched for any sign of inappropriate behavior but found nothing. My wife had been herself, playful, joking, and teasing, the same way she interacted with everyone else in the family. The only incident my wife could think of was from the weekend prior. She and my brother-in-law had reached for the fridge at the same time, playfully jostling to get there first. He let her win, then reached around her waist to grab a beer, his hand lingering slightly longer than it should have. At the time, she brushed it off, not wanting to make a big deal of it. Now, she wondered if her silence had fueled his delusions. As my wife recounted this, my sister listened intently. Her expression softened. "This isn't your fault," she said, her voice firm. She knew my wife well enough to understand that her friendly, outgoing personality wasn't an invitation for anything more. My wife nodded, though the guilt still lingered in her eyes. By the time they finished reviewing the messages, it was clear, there had never been any mutual attraction, no secret flirtations. My brother-in-law had twisted innocent interactions into something they weren't, causing pain and turmoil that was almost unbearable. But at least now, there was clarity. The healing process could begin, though we all knew it would be a long road ahead. For now, my sister's belief in my wife remained unshaken. But then, seeking answers and clarity, my sister began digging through her husband's MacBook, desperate to uncover the full extent of his betrayal. Her hands trembled as she guessed his password, succeeding on the third attempt. With a deep breath, she started searching, each click of the mouse a mixture of anger and dread. It didn't take long for her to stumble across something chilling. Buried in an innocuous-looking folder were dozens of photos of my wife, pictures taken over the years, always of her alone. None of the photos included group settings or candid family moments. They were all focused on her, as if he'd been silently fixated on her all this time. One particular set of images stood out. A few years ago, during a rare adults-only vacation in the Caribbean, my wife had worn a bikini, something she typically avoided in favor of more modest swimwear. But feeling relaxed and carefree, she had indulged in the moment. To my sister's horror, she found nearly 50 photos of my wife in that bikini, each one clearly taken without her knowledge. My sister's face turned pale as she scrolled through the images, her anger giving way to a cold, creeping horror. She muttered aloud, "Does this cross into restraining order territory?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. The discovery had taken the situation beyond mere infatuation. It was now deeply disturbing, a violation of trust on an entirely different level. Unable to keep this to herself, she called us over and showed us the pictures. My wife gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. She had no idea this had been happening. The realization hit her like a physical blow. My sister, though visibly shaken, was already shifting gears to talk about next steps, legal action, restraining orders, and protecting her children. We were all reeling. The man we had trusted as a husband, father, and brother-in-law had shown a side of himself that was dark and deeply unsettling. This was no longer about a misguided confession of feelings, it had become something insidious. Later that night, my sister decided to confront him directly. She set up a FaceTime call with him, bringing my wife into the conversation to ensure he couldn't twist the truth. I listened off camera, my heart pounding with anger and dread. My sister, ever thorough, recorded the entire conversation for good measure. The tension was suffocating as the call began. My brother-in-law looked haggard, his eyes red and swollen from crying. He started hesitantly, his voice shaky, but as he spoke, the truth spilled out, unraveling a story none of us were prepared to hear. He admitted to having been obsessed with my wife for years, since the very day he met her. It started when I first saw her, he confessed in a barely audible voice. He explained how, during one of those early gatherings, he'd been captivated by her presence. At the time, my wife and I were dating, but his feelings had taken root. At first, he tried to dismiss them as a fleeting crush. But as the years went by, the feelings deepened. He became fixated on her personality, her laughter, and the way she interacted with everyone around her. He confessed to orchestrating moments to be near her, volunteering to help with family events, sending trivial text messages, and inventing excuses to spend time in her presence. The more he talked, the more twisted the story became. He had deluded himself into believing that my wife felt the same way, misinterpreting innocent interactions as mutual attraction. My sister listened, her face a mask of controlled rage and heartbreak. She let him talk, his words digging his grave deeper with every sentence. My wife, meanwhile, was visibly shaken. Hearing the depth of his obsession was almost too much for her to bear. When he finally finished, my sister spoke, her voice icy and controlled. "What made you think she would leave her family for you?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. He stammered, mentioning supposed moments of connection that he had entirely fabricated in his mind. That was the breaking point. Both my wife and sister erupted in anger, their voices trembling with betrayal and frustration. My wife, her hands shaking, ended the call abruptly, unable to listen any longer. Turning to me, her eyes wide with fear, she whispered, "It was one-sided. I swear it was one-sided." "I know," I reassured her, my voice calm but firm. "I've never doubted you. Through all the chaos, I held on to the trust we'd built in our relationship. I knew my wife was unwaveringly loyal, and her actions had always reflected that. This ordeal was a dark fantasy concocted by my brother-in-law, one that had nearly torn our family apart. But in this moment, as I held her close, I knew we would weather this storm together." As I sat replaying the chaos in my mind, I couldn't shake the bizarre reality of my brother-in-law's actions. I knew he had an ego, always strutting around with a certain swagger, but I never imagined he could be so delusional as to believe he could pull off something like this. His grandiose fantasies were completely unmoored from reality. Later, I spoke with my sister. The initial shock was starting to wear off, and we could finally discuss the situation calmly. Her focus was resolute, she needed to protect her children from the fallout of their father's actions. "I'm done worrying about him," she said firmly. "My priority now is making sure the kids are okay." She contacted a lawyer to understand her options for limiting his exposure to the kids. Her voice was steely with resolve as she explained her plan. She wasn't interested in salvaging her marriage, she was focused entirely on stability and safety for her children. Despite everything, my brother-in-law returned home yesterday. Legally, my sister couldn't stop him, at least not yet. His presence turned the atmosphere in the house into something heavy and unbearable. He's staying in the guest room now, a silent, defeated figure in a house that no longer feels like his own. The lawyer assured my sister that, with the documented texts, voicemails, and the disturbing cache of photos, she had a strong case for full custody. "He seems to know it's over, there's no fight left in him. As strong as my sister is, this ordeal will inevitably be hard on her kids. They sense something is wrong, kids always do, but they don't know the details yet. My brother-in-law was already an absent figure, often staying overnight at the fire station or pulling double shifts. His physical absence won't be new to them, but the emotional void left by this situation will be harder to navigate. My sister has already contacted a child psychologist to help guide her children through the inevitable questions and emotions that will arise. Her determination to create a stable, loving environment for them is admirable. Meanwhile, the disturbing discoveries keep coming. My wife blocked my brother-in-law's number, but that didn't stop him. He created a new email account and sent her a long, rambling message. It started with an apology but quickly veered into something far darker. He confessed that he never got to finish what he wanted to say at the restaurant, implying he had more to reveal. The email detailed his obsessive feelings for my wife, recounting every moment he admired her smile, laugh, and personality. It was unsettling to see his fixation laid out so plainly. He again insisted there was a mutual attraction, painting a fantasy that existed only in his mind. The worst part was when he shifted his focus to me. His disdain for me was venomous. He attacked my appearance, demeanor, and worth as a husband. He claimed I wasn't satisfying my wife and implied I didn't deserve her. His words were designed to undermine me, to plant seeds of doubt, but instead, they strengthened my resolve. His delusions had twisted his perception of reality, and I knew I had to protect my family from him. We forwarded the email to my sister and her lawyer. It was more damning evidence of his obsession and instability, adding weight to the case for a restraining order. My wife is trying to move forward, but it's been difficult. She feels guilty for having been so comfortable around him. Normally, she's cautious about setting boundaries with other men, but she never expected this behavior from a family member. She trusted him. Now, she's grappling with the reality that her openness and warmth were mistaken for something else entirely. Thankfully, her relationship with my sister remains intact. There's no resentment between them, which is a relief. Their bond, forged over years of friendship and family ties, is proving resilient even in the face of this betrayal. As for me, my primary focus is on supporting my wife and sister through this ordeal. My brother-in-law's actions have had a devastating impact, but we're determined to protect our family and move forward. The road to recovery will be long, but we're taking it one day at a time, leaning on the support of friends, family, and professionals to guide us. This nightmare has shown us the importance of swift action, transparency, and standing firm in the face of toxic behavior. It's a painful lesson, but one we're determined to learn from. What do you think about this story? Share your thoughts below, and thank you for listening to Vibe Tales.